Okay, welcome everyone to the afternoon session. So I'll be talking. So my name is Ramu. I'll be talking about the some of the modeling scenarios and yeah, walk through some examples. So okay, just a little bit about I guess how we go through some of the background stuff, maybe a bit of repetition with what Justin was doing, but I think it's probably necessary just to reinforce some of the terminology we'll be using. What's wrong currently, some of the issues with the pricing, and also what's being proposed. A bit of a recap of risks and reserves and all that stuff, and finally some illustrative examples that we will walk through the actual price calculation and how the energy and reserve prices get interlinked currently and under the proposed changes, and then some simulation results. Okay, so we'll just start off with I guess SPD, which is I guess really the engine that calculates all of this stuff. And I think it's important to just recognize that SPD just uses the information it has. All it knows is these are the costs, and it gets these offers and bids in from participants. And all it tries to do is just say, okay, what's the optimal allocation of these the resources? The resources being energy and reserves. And it says, okay, this is what I want to do, but I need to take into account reserves. I need to take into account ramp rates, constraints, demand, and essentially it's basically trying to clear the market. So we're trying to find out what's the largest. How large can I make this? How large can I make this triangle? So essentially, it's trying to, and when it does that, it calculates the price and the quantity. But it does that simultaneously over at every single market node, and for reserves in each island. So it's juggling lots of things simultaneously, and so sometimes when things come out, it's the interaction of lots of these factors. But sometimes, so it does this every 5 minutes and at least every half an hour. Sometimes it can't do it. There's just not enough resources for it to calculate a solution. And well, we could say you have to do it, but it'll just come back and say, well, I don't have a solution. So the way most markets throughout the world handle this is through these constraint violation penalties. And really, it's just a mechanism to allow us to figure out where is SPD breaking, what's causing it an issue. And it's set at quite high levels so that it doesn't interact with actual energy offers. So in our market, the reserve CVP is the lowest. It's at $100,000, but still that is well above market offers. And its sole purpose is just so that we can kind of figure out when SPD breaks, where they're breaking, and how can we, and what's the issue. So this $100,000 has no economic basis at all. But when it does break, these prices, these CVPs, end up in the market schedules, and we see them, and the traders see them as a price that pops up. But all it is at the moment is just an indicator. So it's just a red flag that something is going wrong, and something needs to get done. And as most people kind of figure out, I mean, the actual prices come out the next day, we don't actually see them. So there's lots of, I guess, uncertainty what the actual price is going to be the next day. And there's a whole manual process that Justin spoke of to resolve these. Okay. So this is an actual example, a real-time dispatch schedule from April last year. And it was in the 6 p.m. evening peak. And what happened was we ran out of fast reserves, so we got two reserve classes. Fast, which is 6 seconds, so this is reserves that must respond in 6 seconds, and 60-second reserve, which, well, responds in 60 seconds and sustains for 15 minutes. So what happens here is that over the evening peak, the HVDC was going hard north, and we ran out of fast reserves in the North Island, and this is the price that pops out, the $100,000 price. And this is what, well, the dispatches saw, and probably in RTP, you would see this $100,000 price. And all that's saying that we ran out of reserve. The energy price kind of gets linked to it, and the way to think of this energy price is really, it's kind of saying, if you got 1 megawatt of energy that you want to sell into the North Island, how much is SPD willing to pay you for that 1 megawatt? And basically it's saying at the Haywards node, SPD is willing to pay you $100,000 and $243 at, and the way SPD calculates that price is basically saying, well, if you give me 1 megawatt at Haywards, what I can do is, before I get to that, let me just jump to the next bit. So in this particular instance, Huntley 5 was the risk setter. Its output was, well, the risk was that level, 397 megawatts, and what was actually happening in the market was, in the North Island, we were clearing, sharing some reserves, and there was some violation. So what SPD is basically saying through the prices is it's saying that, well, because I had to violate the reserves, that's what you're seeing here as a $100,000 price. But also it's saying that if you give me 1 megawatt of energy in the North Island, I can actually take that 1 megawatt and reduce Huntley by 1 megawatt, Huntley 5. And if I reduce Huntley 5 by 1 megawatt, basically I reduce the violation by 1 megawatt. And if I reduce the violation by 1 megawatt, I can save $100,000. But Huntley 5 is also really setting the 60-second risk, so I'm actually saving $100,230, and there's some loss effects, and that's why it's $100,243. So basically, whenever we see these prices, SB is basically giving us the signal that how much is that a megawatt or a marginal unit of energy or reserve worth in that island. So this is what you would see, but what actually happened the next day when actual prices came out. So this is what actually happened when the next day, for the 6 p.m. final pricing, the Haywards price came out at 2.4K, 60 second is high, but nowhere near this. And this was not with any infeasibility, this is the way final pricing ran the next day. And that's just because of the half-hour averaging effects that we see. So really, red lights flash, and this is what happens the next day. Any questions? Just, yeah, shut up.
So what happened to Unit 5?
Did
it stay where it was, or did you back it off?
Well, Unit 5 stayed where it was, well, because it got dispatched, and we ran short of reserves.
So why does the 60-second reserve figure drop to $20 when it wasn't affected by the infeasible price in the real time?
You talking about here?
Half hour every
This is half hour, yeah, this is,
right.
yeah. So I guess just to hop a little bit on what Justin's mentioned, the two important things of real-time pricing is really to give actionable signals in real time and to reflect underlying conditions, both for the short term and for the longer term. And the current pricing process, I think, probably fails on both these accounts. There's no actionable signals, especially during scarcity. We rely on an ex-post process to manage that. And as we've seen, there's quite a bit of uncertainty as to what the prices will be. Just to give an example, the two instances in 2014 when we did use this infeasibility process in final pricing, in both instances the prices were $100,000 in final pricing, but when they were adjusted to the manual process, they ended up at $9,000 on one instance and $5 in the other instance. So that's the range of, even if it does make it through the final pricing, that's the range of variability we can see.
You couldn't have got a better illustration if we'd made it up.
Yeah. So, well, that's So, just what it probably means is that we want to, the first thing we want to do is move the CVPs away from infeasibility indicators to economic indicators. So that was the first thing that was envisaged, closing this gap, closing this loop, so SPD can churn through and start producing prices. But, so that basically means moving our CVPs from the current 500K and 100K to basically something reflecting increasing cost of shortfall. And these are the test curves that we use in our simulations, and they kind of reflect what was being discussed. So we got a 10K tranche, a 15, and a 20K for energy violation, and separate ones for fast and sustained reserves. There's a slight difference here with fast reserves being slightly higher, and the consultation paper goes through why that's probably the case. So you'll see there's a bit of a gap between these two, and that's really to allow the reserve to violate before energy. But when these were reduced, I mean, basically they showed up some flaws in the current model, and really that's because when we start reducing the CVPs to economic indicators, it starts suppressing the energy price to levels where it actually undercuts actual market offers. So that's what triggered this the second change. So I'll go a little bit just to maybe talk a little bit about the co-optimization of risks before we jump into the detail, just to make sure that we're clear when we talk about this later on. So when we co-optimize risks and reserves, it's looking around for the best possible solution for both the 6 and 60 seconds. But sometimes there can be multiple risks in the island. So this is the example that when SPD gets to this solution, it's basically saying this is the best solution I could get to given what you told me, because I'm optimizing based on what you indicated were the offers and the bids and all the constraints I have. This is the best solution I could get to. There's no other solution that's better than this. That's essentially what it's saying. And when at the solutions, risk A will be setting the actual maximum risk, and we'll be procuring reserves against that. We could get a situation where it could be 2 risks at the same level, and we'll be procuring reserves against that. So this could be a Huntley unit and TCC, or the HVDC. Yeah, so basically just reiterating that. So what happens when we get a violation with the risk? So currently, this is the way the reserve violation model works. We have the risk setting the requirements, and we try and buy reserves, or SPD try to find reserves relative to this maximum risk. But when it can't do it, it said, okay, if I'm short, this is the violation against the maximum risk. So when it violates, this is the best it could do. SPD can't find any other resource to meet it, and because really it is the last resort. So what actually happens here? So if you take our analogy of what 1 megawatt of energy is worth into the market, if you give me 1 megawatt of energy in the market, I can take that 1 megawatt and reduce risk A by 1 megawatt. So my 1 megawatt of energy is worth the reserve CVP, because I can reduce the violation by 1 megawatt. Similarly, if you give me 1 megawatt of reserve, I can take that 1 megawatt of reserve and actually increase the amount of cleared reserves. So this red line, I can increase it. So I can increase, and so I can actually also reduce my violation by 1 megawatt. So in this situation, 1 megawatt of energy is kind of equivalent to 1 megawatt of reserve. And so we'll tend to see this kind of relationship. A similar relationship happens when we have under the status quo, if we have 2 risks that are being violated, because under the status quo, we only procure against the maximum risk. So the fact that risk B is also violating is, SB is oblivious to it. It says, okay, I don't really care about it, because the only thing you told me to do was find the largest risk and buy reserves against that largest risk, and that's all it's trying to do. And the violation is tagged against that. So the fact that risk B is not being covered is basically, doesn't really matter. So if we run through the same kind of trade-offs of how much is 1 megawatt of energy worth and how much is 1 megawatt of reserve worth, they come up to a similar relationship. They both worth the value of the CVP. But now the trick happens in our current system when we have multiple risks. So here, when we have multiple risks, again, I'll just labor the point that this is the best it could do. It got to this point because there's no other low-cost solution. Now, if you give me 1 megawatt of energy, what's the best way for SPD to use the 1 megawatt of energy that you give it? Well, it could reduce risk A by 1 megawatt, but if you reduce risk A, you make no impact on the violation because risk B will still be setting the violation, still be setting the maximum. So the best way SPD could use the 1 megawatt that you give it of energy is to reduce each of these guys, risk A and risk B, by half a megawatt each. So if you reduce them by half a megawatt each, the actual maximum risk reduces by half a megawatt, which reduces your violation by half a megawatt. So 1 megawatt of energy is worth half a megawatt of violation. But now, 1 megawatt of reserve, how much is that worth? If you give me 1 megawatt of reserves, I can basically increase my cleared reserves by 1 megawatt and reduce the violation by 1. So I got a situation here where 1 megawatt of reserve is worth twice the value of energy. So twice the value of energy. So when this happens, when these situations happens, we get the reserve price being multiples of the energy price under the status quo. Right. Now that poses some issues when we move to CVPs that are more economic in their level. It doesn't really pop up under our status quo because the CVPs are so high, they're like $100,000. So even if you halve them or divide them by 3, they're still like $33,000. And they're still well above market offers. So you're still clearing market offers pretty much normally, and you're oblivious to the fact that this is actually happening under the hood. But it only kind of manifests itself when the CVPs are now brought into line of, say, 4.5K. And when you start dividing it by 2 and dividing it by 3, now it actually starts cutting out actual market offers that are not being cleared. And that's what this next example, I think, is trying to show. So this is really a stylized example, but it's kind of sort of similar. You've got some hydro in the South Island, some offering in. And I must thank Chung for basically coming up with this kind of these examples that I'm running through here. And there's the North Island demand. So we got some cheap South Island hydro. We got some fossil fuels, so maybe it looks like a coal station, I guess. A gas turbine. These two are what's called risk setters in SPD, so they can set the risk. We got a peaker, and we got a portfolio of other plants in the North Island. So all these are North Island plant, and this is the South Island plant. And we got our violation prices here, reflective of economic conditions, economic costs. So SPD cleared the market the way it would. So it says the optimal allocation of the resources based on what the inputs are all what's shown in red. So we got the DC doing about 240 megawatts. There are actually three binding risks for FIR, and those three are the coal unit, and the risk is 220 megawatts plus 20, because you have to cater for the the FIR in the risk calculation, because when you lose that unit, you also lose its FIR or SIR. We have 240 megawatts at the gas turbine and 240 megawatts on the HVDC. So those are the three binding risks. So we have no violation here, but we can see this multiplier effect coming in. So the energy price is $100, and the reason why it's $100 is because, again, if we run through our analogy again, if I were to offer 1 megawatt in the North Island, SPD would say, okay, I can take your 1 megawatt and I can actually reduce this guy by 1 megawatt, and the benefit to the system is $100. So I'm willing to pay you $100 for that 1 megawatt of energy. The 1 megawatt of reserve, if we only run through the 1 megawatt of FIR is basically saying, if you give me 1 megawatt of FIR in the North Island, what I can do is increase my amount of reserves from 240 to 241. I can bring an additional megawatt across the HVDC, an additional megawatt from this guy, and an additional megawatt from this guy. So I can increase 1, 2, 3 megawatts into the North Island, and I can reduce this guy by 3 megawatts. Hence, so there's a bit of accounting for how much these guys cost, and that's why you get a little bit of a difference. But on balance, it's about 3 times. So that's these multiplier effects still hold even when there's no scarcity. Okay, now suppose the demand increased slightly. So the demand increased by 5 megawatts. We got the same situation, but now we're running into a bit of trouble. We're running out of North Island FIR. So to meet that additional 5 megawatts of demand, I bring in an additional 1.67 on the DC, an additional 1.67 from these 2 other risk setters. But now there's insufficient reserves to cover the additional 1.67 of reserves of FIR. So what happens? I now violate, this is under the status quo, I violate my FIR at the price of $4,500, and that's what's showed in the FIR price. But the multiplier effect takes into account, and so the energy price with 3 binding risks is now about 1/3 the FIR price. So this is a bit of an issue here because I'm running short of reserves, but I've still got some plant that's not being dispatched. And the reason why is because the way the current pricing works is that my energy price is not rising high enough to trigger plants. So I'm undercutting actual market offers. So this is, I guess, the crux of the issue we're seeing with the current reserve violation model. Okay, so I guess just to illustrate, so this is what's actually happening in that example. So we've got the 3 risks with the 240 megawatts cleared and 1.67 violated. Yeah, and that's really the price calculation. So to address this, really, it was the idea was to move away from a reserve violation model that only accounts for the violation of the actual maximum risk to taking into account the violation on each individual risk. So SPD doesn't think that it can have these additional violations at no cost or reflect the increasing cost. So if I run through that same example with under the risk violation model, so this is with the additional 5 megawatts of demand. I see that the energy price now rises up to $3,000. And the reason why it's risen up to $3,000 now is because previously SPD thought it can violate the actual maximum risk, and it costs $4,500. But now SPD knows if I need to violate the risk, I need to violate it on 3 of them. So it's actually a lot more costly for me to violate the risk. So let me look around if there's other cheaper energy that I could use that's lower cost. And essentially the energy price starts rising. And as the energy price rises, and it kind of triggers the peaker to get used. And so that's why in this situation we get the peaker being used, because the energy price rises because of the additional cost of violating more risks. So we still get the 3-to-1 ratio, but now the energy price is a lot higher to reflect the fact that it's a higher cost to violate more of the risks. Okay, so this was just running through the pricing calculation again. This talking through the same mechanics of how much is 1 megawatt of energy worth in the North Island. It's worth $3,000 because I can offset the peaker by 1 megawatt, and 1 megawatt of FIR is actually worth 3 times the peaker because it can increase each of the risks and reduce the peaker by 3 megawatts. So the fact that the peaker was at $3,000 was fine, but what if the peaker is at $5,000? So this now the peaker is it's more expensive than violating reserves. So under this situation, under the risk violation model, we actually go into reserve shortfall. So the HVDC is basically goes up to 245 megawatts. We have 5 megawatts of FIR violation, and we start getting the 3-to-1 ratio. But now we see the energy price is a lot higher. The energy price takes on the reserve violation price, because SPD says, well, it's actually cheaper for me to violate the reserve than use this peaker. So we got the 3-to-1 price. But to calculate the price is a little bit trickier in this case. So what happens here is that your 1 megawatt of energy, if you were to offer it into the North Island, SPD will tell you, well, if you give me 1 megawatt of energy, I can reduce my the HVDC by 1 megawatt. And if I reduce the HVDC by 1 megawatt and it is violating the risk, I can save 4.5K, which is the violation price. But if you give me 1 megawatt of FIR in the North Island, I can do a bunch of things. I can actually increase my reserves from 240 to 241. That's how much of reserves I can clear in the North Island because of the additional one that you gave me. And by doing that, I can increase my risk A and B by 1 megawatt each, because now they can, I have more reserves to cover them. Each of them increase by 1 megawatt. That allows me to reduce my HVDC by 2 megawatts. But now I also have that additional megawatt of reserves, so I'm only violating the HVDC by 2 megawatts. And so the reserve price actually ends up back being 3 times the energy price. But now it's at 3 times 4.5K. I probably didn't explain that very well. But, I mean, yeah, so just let me know if you want me to explain it again. Okay. So I guess the benefits of moving to the risk violation model was really to remove these price suppression effects, and also to maintain really the efficient trade-offs. And I'm trying to illustrate in these examples that even though we move to the risk violation, the efficient trade-offs still exist. I mean, we're still having energy and reserve being evaluated at their respective levels. So if energy is worth 1 megawatt, worth more than or at least the same as reserve, it would be, or alternatively, reserve valued more than energy, then it comes through in the relative prices. So how much? Is there any questions about the examples, or can I mean, no? Okay. So what we basically did then was take the risk violation model and ran it through kind of historic dispatch scenarios. So this is using RTD cases from the system operator, and we focused them on looking at high price scenario. Sorry. On looking at the high prices of scarcity or near scarcity situations. And there was 75 of these scenarios that we had modeled. So we only considered those that were dispatched. The test curve that we used for this simulation was kind of based on the ones that was presented earlier. So we have the energy violation curve, the risk violation, starting off at 4.5K and 4K for the 60-second. And we call this the lower price kind of option, and there's a higher price option that starts off at a higher first tranche. And we did further sensitivities on making this first tranche wider, basically. So we just want to see, given this framework, when we start turning the dials of increasing the prices and increasing the widths of these tranches, what effects does it have? So this is, I guess, just pulled out of the consultation paper. So just a little bit of what this means when you read through it. So if we just focus on this is looking at the total violation over the 75 scenarios that we looked at. The blue line is the total amount of reserve violation in those 75 scenarios. So if you look at the solid lines initially, the solid lines relate to the lower price, the lower price risk violation curve. And so what we see is that we start off with less reserve violation, but as we start increasing the tranche, then we will tend to get more reserve violation, and I guess that kind of makes sense, because the wider you make the tranche of a low price reserve option, the more reserve violation you'll get. Similarly, we start getting a decline in energy violation. And the reason we get a decline in energy violation is because we start foregoing reserve more often. If we increase the tranches, the price of the tranches, then we'll tend to get a higher level of energy violation, and that's because we'll transition into energy violation a lot quicker if we make the reserve curve a lot closer to the energy shortfall. And similarly, we'll reduce the amount of reserve violation. So what happens also is that as you increase the price of the reserve violation curve, you increase the chances of reserve violation before energy. So this plot is basically trying to see, for each of the instances, how are we violating energy and reserves in the different scenarios. So we have on the x-axis, we have the amount of energy violation in each of those 75 samples. On the y-axis, we have the amount of reserve violation in each of the samples. And what we see is that for most of the scenarios, we tend to get reserve violation without any energy violation. So we're able to clear the market with some reserve violation. In some instances, we get energy violation with reserve violation in the first tranche. And for others, we see, so the first tranche is 10 megawatts. And for the other scenarios, we tend to get reserve violation when the energy violation when the reserve moves out of the first tranche. So increasing T1, the increasing tranche 1, which is the hollow circles, we see we'll tend to get a higher level of reserve violation before we even trigger energy. So that's why this all these jump up here. Now, what happens if we make the prices a lot closer together? So this is when the reserve violation curve moves closer to the energy violation, so there's not much of a gap between them. So when this happens, we start increasing the likelihood of having energy violation before we even get to reserve violation. And so what happens is that sometimes we can get, if they're too close to one another, the loss effects as well as the marginal cost effects could mean that we actually will trigger, it's actually cheaper to shed load at Kaikoui or Kaitai than run short of reserves because of the benefit of losses. So that's, I guess, the trick of if we're making them too close to each other, then we can start getting into energy violation a lot quicker. So in terms of the price impact of this, I mean, this was really to see if this is going to send efficient sort of investment signals, what prices come out of this on average, depending on whether you use a curve with a higher price or a curve with more tranches or wider tranches. So the lower price, the curve, the risk violation with the lower price produces on average, this is the average price at the Hayward's node for each over the 75 scenarios. And we see with a shorter tranche, we're getting about a 5.7K price signal. So on average, this is what a plant will be seeing that's responding to it. And as you make that tranche wider, then you start reducing the price signal. And the reason is really because you start undercutting market offers more and more as you make that first tranche wider and wider. So the risk is if you start making that tranche too wide, then you start reducing the price signal. Converse is if you increase the price of the reserve risk violation, then you increase the price signal, but you start triggering energy shortfall a lot more often, as we saw in the previous slide. Increasing the tranche had the same effect, but to less an extent. So you still get a declining effect the wider you make that tranche. Wow, I think that's. So I guess this is pretty much. Well, I guess the summary of all this was really to see if how can we address the scarcity pricing in under RTP, because the current ex-post arrangements don't seem to be able to do the trick. And really, it's when we move the CBPs into the realm of economic costs, then these flaws start popping up. So the risk violation approach seems to be a way of addressing this. So not only taking into account the economic costs, but also correctly valuing the reserve shortfalls. And finally, when we looked at the actual market outcomes, we see that when we start turning the dials on the prices and the quantities, that it had the desired effect. So, yeah, I was thinking there'd be more questions as I was going through, but I got to the end of it. But if there are any questions on any of the examples or stuff like that, please let me know.
Rama, could you talk to a wee bit, Justin already mentioned, but going out with the slide pack was going to be some a spreadsheet and work data and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Is there anything, are you familiar with that, or anything you can say about that information?
So, yep, so in that, so these plots are all in that, I believe, in that workbook. So these would be the results of the simulations on the 75 dispatch cases, So you were able to go through them and have a look at how these were calculated.